we're going to look now at this text, Totem and Taboo. I've left the German title, just to explain. Einige Übereinstimmungen im Seelenleben der Wilden und Neurotiker. Some Überstimmungen means correspondences between the Seelenleben, the soul life, the life of the soul, in other words, the psyche. We use in English and in what we speak of psychology. Psyche means in ancient Greek living principle. Like the Hebrew word nefesh, all the Hebrew words, ruach, nefesh, and so on, it usually applies to the breath or living principle. In fact, in Latin, it's translated as anima, which of course is related to the word animal in English. But anima, which also originally means life principle, like for example, animations. When you talk about cartoons, it's an animated cartoon because it's alive. But eventually it becomes to be understood philosophically as an entity which we call the soul. Even in Hebrew, when we talk about nefesh, ruach, and so on, we have this idea that there's a soul, there's this entity called the soul. And so psychology is a science of the soul. In German, it's Seele, this word over here. Right? Seele means soul. So Seelenleben, the life of the soul. Der Wilden, wild, like English word wild right there, and Neurotica, neurotics. So Freud is telling you in the title what he's going to do. In this book, he's going to look at the psychology of two types of human beings, and he's going to compare them. On the one hand, neurotics, which is his specialty, right? He's a professor, he's a doctor, literally a doctor of the soul, and a professor. And he's going to compare the neuroses that he's been examining to his understanding, and based on we're going to look at the historians who and the ethnologists who study this, the lives of what today you would never be able to publish a book with this word in the title, wilden, wild people, in other words, primitives. You can't use, today it's politically incorrect to say that people who live in the Amazon are primitives. Right? At that time, of course, it was very normal. You say these are primitive human beings. Look, they're naked, they have no technology, they have nothing, they're primitive. Right? Today, you say, well, no, you can't be primitive. Okay, fine. It doesn't. I don't care. I don't care about political correctness so much. But at this time, of course, it's absolutely fine to use the word primitive, or of course the word savage. Right? Savage is also a word that we would never use today, but is very common at that period in history, the early 20th century. We'll talk about savages. We're going to look mostly at this last chapter as a prelude to understanding his book on Moses, because really the whole book on Moses he's reading the Chumash, he's reading the 5 books of Moses, as they're known in German, but he is reading them through a psychological construct, a schema that he has developed in this book on Totem and Taboo. By the way, what just to clarify, what is Totem and Taboo? Taboo, as you will work backwards, because he spends most of his time talking about totems. Taboo is a Polynesian word, which means prohibited, assume, right? That's what taboo, even today we use the word, oh, that's taboo. And it's a phenomena that you find across the board in all human civilizations. Certain things are forbidden, taboo. And totem, this is, I included a picture from my Canadian heritage. Totem poles are a Canadian phenomenon, especially in the Canadian West. In British Columbia, the Haida Indians have the most beautiful totem poles. The word totem comes from totem, which is an Ojibwe word. Again, it's from I grew up in Toronto, mostly in Toronto, that part of Canada. Ontario, Quebec, and Manitoba was populated by a group of native Canadians. It's still populated. There are still Ojibwe. I met them personally myself. Ojibwe or Algonquin. Algonquin is the larger family group. So the Ojibwe natives, in their language, in Ojibwe, there's a word totem, which an anthropologist universalized and became used for all so-called primitive peoples, including people of Africa, people of Australia, in other words, the indigenous aboriginal natives of these different places. They had different customs which the word totem was applied to, even though totem is an Ojibwe word. I don't know, I've said too many words. Is that clear? Yeah. There are other interesting Ojibwe words. I just looked this up yesterday and I didn't know this. I didn't know that I know a few Ojibwe words. Chipmunk, you know what a chipmunk is? Or moccasin, or moose. These are all Ojibwe words. Toboggan.
The most recent ancestors are in the bottom. The most recent ancestors.
It may be. You know this for a fact?
No, I'm asking.
So, from what I understand from totem poles is that it might be ancestors, or it might also just be a story. Sometimes a totem pole is just telling you a story. This happened, and this happened, and this happened, and that happened. But typically, yes, as we're going to see here, when Freud analyzes it.
From bottom up or?
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know if it's up, down, or down, up. And this is a short one. Sometimes there are totem poles that are incredibly tall. Incredibly tall. So, it could be rows of ancestors, it could be a narrative, but totem, in the way that it's used universally, the ways Freud uses, is more just about ancestors, right? An ancestor which is identified with an animal, as we're going to see. Now, this book, interesting, even before we jump into it, I want to mention, we don't have it in our edition, but you can find it online. The book, Totem and Taboo, was translated into Hebrew, 1934, I believe, but I think it was published 1939 in Israel. And Freud wrote a special preface for the Hebrew edition, which he wrote in German, of course, but it was translated into Hebrew. He says, no reader of the Hebrew version of this book will find it easy to put himself in the emotional position of the author, who is ignorant of the language of Holy Writ, which is not quite true. He, as I mentioned, he did have a Hebrew education, but I guess he forgot it. Who is completely estranged from the religion of his fathers. He's no longer part of the religion, as well as from every other religion. Who cannot take a share in a nationalist ideal, in other words, in Zionism. He wasn't a fan of Zionism, although he wasn't anti-Zionist. There's a letter that Freud wrote to Herzl. Herzl, of course, is from Budapest, but
everybody's from Budapest.
Everybody's from Budapest, yeah. So Freud wrote a letter. He sent a copy of an interpretation of dreams to Herzl, and he wrote a letter to Herzl saying, it was because Herzl was in charge of the Freie Presse. He had a feuilleton in Vienna, which was famous. So Freud sent up a copy, to write a review of it. And he wrote to Herzl, by the way, even if you don't write a review, that's fine. Please keep my book as a token of admiration for your work. In other words, for what you've done for the Jewish people. But in any case, he wasn't a pro-Zionist, but he wasn't anti either. So who cannot take a share in nationalist ideals, but who has never repudiated his people, who feels that he is in an essential nature a Jew, and who has no desire to alter that nature. If the question were put to him, since you have abandoned all these common characteristics of your countrymen, what is there left to you that is Jewish? What? You have nothing. You're not a Zionist. You can't read Hebrew. You're not religious. What's Jewish about you? So he says, I would reply a very great deal, and probably his very essence. That's probably the most interesting line. He could not express he could not now express that essence clearly in words, but someday, no doubt, it will be accessible to the scientific mind. I'll just stop there. He's saying psychology is in essence a Jewish thing. Obviously, on the surface, it's not. On the surface, not only is it not Jewish, it's anti-Jewish. But in its essence, and we'll have to explore that. I think it's too early to ask why. But I think it'll come out in our reading of Freud. How is psychology, in its essence, a Jewish science? Okay, so we discussed the word totem. Totem, by the way, we're just starting to talk about what exactly a totem is. First of all, a simple a simple association of what a totem is understood by heraldry. This is what in Hungarian is called a turul bird, right? The turul is apparently some type of falcon, a mythical, quasi-mythical falcon, which is used in across all kinds of Hungarian. In English, I don't know what's called Hungarian, but heraldry. Heraldry is where you use some type of animal to symbolize something about a nation. Not only is Hungary have a predator bird, but so does America, of course. My father, Oliver Shalom, used to say all the countries of the world always chose predatorial birds. You know, Japan also, Nazi Germany, and so on. Right? He said, why doesn't anyone have a duck? You know, the duck as the national bird, right? Everybody wants this fierce, predatorial, tough bird. I mean, it's obvious why, right?
Our second choice was the turkey.
Was the turkey, the American turkey, which is a kosher bird, right? That's funny.
There's one exception.
Yeah.
King Matthias used the crow.
Which one?
King Matthias of Hungary.
He used a crow?
Yeah.
Oh, interesting. A crow is
with a golden ring in his beak.
Oh, interesting.
So actually it's a good thing because I'm the smartest among the birds.
There are, so you know, totems actually are, totems have all kinds of animals. They would have crows, they would have ducks. You know, a totem could be an insect. Doesn't have to be dafka, you know, the most powerful animal. Totems were, well, we should look at it together actually at this point. I want to open our text we'll look at this code. By the way, you know, Jews also, even though we stay away from images, but for example, famous totem today, which when I was living in Yerushalayim, you have a lion as a very typical totem, Israeli totem. Even on the Sefer Torah, we often have two lions, you know, on each side of the Torah. When Yaakov Avinu, when Jacob gives blessings to his sons, some of them are compared to animals. For example, Benjamin is compared to a zev, to a wolf, and so on. So Jews also know something about totem animals. Let me just give you the background here. This is probably the most important background to this text. There was a famous and important British ethnologist, I guess we could call him, ethnologist or anthropologist, so famous and so important that he was made a Sir. He was knighted by the Queen, named James Fraser. James Fraser wrote a multi-volume work. He's more famous for a big work, a 12-volume work called The Golden Bough, which is a systematic, comprehensive treatment of mythologies across all cultures. But before, I believe this was before The Golden Bough, he wrote also a 4-volume, also gigantic. This guy when he didn't write one book, he would write 4 volumes, 10 volumes, 12 volumes. He wrote a 4-volume work on totemism and exogamy. We'll see in a second what exactly exogamy is and how totemism is connected to exogamy. And this is really the background to Freud's book. At that time, there were a number of works discussing totemism, this phenomenon of totemism. What is totemism? Totemism is it could be called a type of religion, although it might be safer to call it not a religion, but a proto-religion. Because when we say religion, we're usually talking about gods, a God. We believe as Jews that there is only one God, Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad. Of course, we know that many other religions have more than one God. And from Jewish standpoint, that's a problem. Judaism is famous for challenging polytheism, what we call polytheism, right? That there are many gods. But polytheism, of course, is still a religion. As I like to point out to people who are hyper frum, God, Hashem himself in the Torah, in a way, is a polytheist. Why? Because Hashem himself, God, says, be careful, don't worship Elohim acherim. Asher atem zonim achareihem, right? Don't worship other gods. Why is God talking about other gods? Does God believe there is other gods? Apparently he does. At least psychologically. Of course, there's also, we also say, Ein od milvado, there is no other God. There's only Hashem Echad. In one sense, we say Hashem Echad. In another sense, Hashem himself says, there's many gods. And don't worship them. They're a problem. Whether it's, Dagon of the Philistines, Ashteret, Baal, and so on. And of course, anyone who reads Greek and Roman mythology, which is the most famous type of mythology in Europe.
And Bereshit bara Elohim.
Well, Bereshit bara Elohim is more complicated because that's just the word, as the Rambam points out in the Moreh Nevuchim, in the Guide of the Perplexed, the Hebrew word Elohim is complicated because it has four possible meanings. First of all, Elohim can be human beings. There's places in the Chumash where Elohim clearly refers to judges. A judge, like we have a halacha which says that when an Eved Ivri, a Jewish slave, wants to remain a slave, he has to be taken to the door, and his ear has to be hammered into the mezuzah of the door, but it says he has to be brought lifnei Elohim. And most of the poskim say lifnei Elohim doesn't mean before God. It means before judges. There's a bet din. That's number one. Number two, Elohim could refer to angels. They could be angelic beings. Number three, Elohim could refer to gods, Elohim acherim, other gods. And number four, Elohim could refer to God. And then, of course, there is the problem. How can you refer to God, which is Hashem Echad, with a plural word? And it becomes all kinds of interesting...
And also Beit stones.
A stone is Elohim? I've never heard of that.
Beit were stones.
But Beit... Okay. Oh, in that sense. Okay, so in other words, Avodah Zarah could refer to Elohim, to a god, like Baal, or Ashteret. I'm not sure what you're getting at, but we'll see. Actually, this does become an issue here.
Jacob's dream.
Yeah, Jacob's dream at Bet El, right?
And he was.
Yeah, Bet El, yeah. But of course, Bet El is Bet El. It's the house of God, right? So you're saying. So it's not that the house is God. It's at the house of God, Bet El, right? But you're right that when we're talking about Avodah Zarah, we're talking about idolatry. Idolatry is very complicated because it's not clear what the relationship is between the object and the God. Is the object a representation of the God? Or is the object God? Or does it even matter? From our standpoint, it matters because we think very logically, we think scientifically. So we say, if I worship this, if I bow down to it, then what? And I think this is God? For example, the Rambam says in the Moreh Nevuchim and also in Masechet Avodah Zarah, he says no human being ever worshipped an object and thought that it was God. Which to us sounds weird. What do you mean? That is God. The Rambam says no, never. That's not Avodah Zarah. Avodah Zarah means that it represents God. And that is Avodah Zarah. That is idolatry. In any case, when we talk about religion, which is not Judaism or Christianity or Islam, in other words, we're talking about polytheism or idolatry. We're talking about modes of belief where there are such things as gods. And of course there are many gods. And there's a hierarchy of gods. In Greek mythology, as I'm sure you know, there's 12 Olympians. Zeus is the number one god. And then there are gods just below him, Apollo, Hera, and so on. But there's 12 Olympians. And beyond the 12 Olympians, there are other gods. The Greek Olympians are only the Olympian gods. In other words, there were non-Olympian gods also. But religion in general means that there are gods of some sort, however many there are. Now, totemism is a religion which is more primitive than that. It's not easy to say that the so-called gods of totemism are really gods as we understand it. It's an incredibly primitive, if I can use that word, I'm going to use that word, I don't care. It's not politically correct, but I'm going to use the word primitive. There are societies even existing today, for example in the Australian outback, Australian Aboriginals in the Amazon and so on. There are societies where there are clearly these people have spiritual beliefs, but it's difficult to say whether what they believe in, which is powers, some type of power, whether they are gods properly speaking. Because they're definitely not gods that create the world or have power. It's not even a mountain god or the god of weather. When you study Greek mythology, you know that different gods have different zones, different regions that they take care of. Zeus is in charge of lightning and the weather. Poseidon is in charge of earthquakes and the sea. Aphrodite is in charge of beauty and feminine sexuality. Dionysus is in charge of male or whatever, wanton sexuality and alcohol. Right? Each god has his own department. When we're talking about totems, it's not even like that. They don't have departments. They're not these super powerful gods. They're much more personal and much more private gods, much more local. In the Torah, by the way, there is mention of these also. Probably the most famous one, most famous mention that people know, is if you know the story when Yaakov Avinu runs away with Rachel and Leah from his father-in-law Lavan.
And they took away the water.
Exactly. In Hebrew it's called Terafim. Terafim, or what in Latin, Lares et Penates, it's called. Lares et Penates, or Terafim, is family tchotchkes. Right? Family gachkes, sorry, not tchotchkes. Gachkes. Gachkes is Yiddish for Götzen, idols. These are small family idols that people would keep, would identify as their family spirits. And they knew that it wasn't some super powerful God. This was my family's protector spirit. Usually an ancestor, of course. As I'm sure you know, in China, for example, or in the Orient in general, to this day, of course, ancestor worship is a very living type of spirituality. People have all kinds of private rituals. They sacrifice an orange with incense and so on to the ancestors, the ancestor of the family. So what is an ancestor? Do they believe that an ancestor is a god? Well, it's close maybe to what we would call a god, but definitely not a full-blown god in our sense of the word. It's somewhere between a ghost and a god. And this is basically what a totem is. That's what the word totem means. A totem is an ancestor, is an ancestral, in English it's called a tutelary spirit. Tutelary means watching over you. Or what's also called a daimon, a demon.